Writers, let's talk writing interiority. Essentially, writing interiority means structuring your prose in such a way that you capture the inner lives of your characters, their idiosyncrasies, their personalities, and their unique psychologies. Exploring the interiority of your characters not only brings them to life on the page, but it can also bring your prose to life, essentially binding the written word with a character's mind. Most of the advice that you're bound to receive when looking into writing interiority revolves around stream of consciousness, essentially using your prose to reflect the rhythm, psychology, and sensory details of a character's subjective experience, such that the writing feels like a microscope of sorts on the character's inner life. Writers who do this extremely well include the likes of Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, but also more recent authors like Elizabeth Strout or Jennifer Egan. There are a lot of different ways of approaching stream of consciousness such that you capture interiority, but I wanted to share with you two closely related strategies for doing so, both of which are relatively easy and practical. For both of these pieces of advice, let's assume that we're writing a story from a third person point of view. And this first piece of advice that I have involves this term psychic distance. Psychic distance refers to the space between the narrator of a story and the character in that story. Some authors, like Kurt Vonnegut, for instance, often create a lot of space between the narrator and the character, meaning that the narrator has a very clear or implicit personality, a method of speaking, or outlook on the world that is not necessarily shared by our main character. So when reading Vonnegut, it oftentimes feels like you have someone narrating the life of somebody else for you. And this works really well for Vonnegut because his narrators are often an integral character in his writing. But if you wanted to more closely examine the interiority of your character, you could close your psychic distance by joining your narrative voice with the mind of the character, essentially rendering that third person narrator invisible. Let's say, for instance, that your character is at a grocery store perusing the selection of frozen meals. If our psychic distance was quite separate and far, it might look something like this. Quote, Martha looked at the selection of frozen meals feeling entirely dissatisfied. This simply won't do, she thought. She wanted something cheap but healthy, but all of the meals before her were expensive and loaded with all sorts of ingredients she deemed to be terrible. She looked around for anything that would not take a year or more off her life. Finally, she decided to purchase a bag of apples just because this was at least familiar to her. Here we can see some interiority of our character. We learn that she's health conscious, picky, maybe even a bit judgy by some measure, but we learn that from basically being told by our narrator. If we wanted more of a glimpse into Martha's psychology and interior life, we could close that psychic distance, binding our narrator to Martha's psychology and let the writing do that exploration for us. Martha stood before the selection of frozen meals. This simply would not do. Spending $5 on a plastic tray of pasta stuffed with chemicals? No thank you. She quite liked her arteries as they were. Dr. Abernathy said her cholesterol was better than most at her age. Even the supposedly healthy options were loaded with enough sodium to kill a horse, and even horses have the good sense to eat an apple instead. So be it. She searched for the apples instead. In this second example, we've gotten much closer into Martha's mind, such that there is no real distinction between the narrator's voice and the unique, somewhat prickly voice of Martha's internal monologue. The things we see in this passage are couched through how Martha herself experiences them. Feels like we're touring someone's thoughts as opposed to somebody else relating those thoughts back to us. Notice, for instance, that mention of Dr. Abernathy without introduction or contextualization into who that is, the same way that you think of people in your life kind of offhandedly. This leads me to my second piece of advice, which is a bit more practical. If you want to produce more interiority in your narration, look for any instance in your writing in which you're using those words like look, thought, felt, saw, feared, worry, or other kind of sensory processing words, and then see if you can get rid of them or change them. Ironically, these sorts of words that tell us what a character is seeing or feeling actually distance us from that character. Consider the difference, for example, between saying something like, quote, he worried he had let her down and feared she would never speak to him again, versus, quote, he had let her down, she may never speak to him again. In the second instance, we're getting this directly from the character by way of that closely aligned narrator, and it's truer to experience. After all, if you feel you have let somebody down, and assuming you don't have a great therapist, do you think to yourself, I feel I let them down? Or does your worry simply take the shape of saying to yourself, I let them down? So, by removing these words that come from the narrator and not the character, it also removes that veil of a narrator and brings us directly into contact with that character's rich inner life.